Thank you. Jack Dan from Telstra. I have the benefit of having spending a few years doing some research for a PhD thesis around behavioral economics, cognitive science, and all of that. So I'll start with a comment for Michael. And I'll say that I have a slightly different view of nudge. Nudge at the construct level is really about about replacing an existing default choice or text or message. So I'm not quite sure that I agree with you about the transparency of it. At an action level, nudge is about providing a choice. It's replacing an existing push. It's replacing a default action. If you're saying that, for example, and this is a very well-quoted example, your neighbors are using 20% less energy than you're doing, you're not actually saying to someone, you have to use less energy. So I'm interested in your comments and a little bit more of an exploration around that idea of nudge and transparency associated with it. And the second point for Alan, just wanted to say that some of the research I've been doing in my current role at Telstra regarding kind of citizen to government engagement and service delivery highlight a very interesting point about the nature of the number of interactions and the perceptions of services from the public's point of view. And one of the most interesting things we found out was that the more a citizen engages with the government, the better their view of the performance of service delivery actually is. And that correlates with your point about the selective nature and the importance of each instance of interaction. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that comment. I was, as you probably detected, being slightly provocative. But nonetheless, I think there's truth to what I was suggesting, and I was interested to hear the words there that nudge provides a choice. Well, it does, doesn't it? But it provides a choice that's already kind of been decided. It's not a completely free and frank, to quote our New Zealand friends, choice. It's not an open choice. It's a guided choice. No, I'm not saying there's anything unethical about it or sinister. Without question, the behavioural approach is for benevolence, to make better choices, to make better public policy, and make better outcomes for people. There's no question about that. But in doing so, it requires an already pre-authorised understanding of what the outcome should be that we nudge people towards. Now, we can debate it all we want. I totally respect that. But from my point of view, that's not an open choice, as other things would be. It genuinely isn't. And furthermore, that even if we suggest that it is, because people don't have to choose to do it, of course, people don't have to, although they're guided towards it. The point is, it's not a transparent guidance either, is it? Like, some of the examples you said, it's how you frame the question. And we know that how you frame a particular question is going to get a particular response. We know that. Well, that's not very transparent, is it?
Okay, we might hand over to Michael. Sorry, to Alan.
There's an interesting aspect to the nudge thing. I'll just jump in there. It turns out probably would be okay if they knew, because most people, even if they know about the behavioral economic stuff, are still susceptible to it. There's a beautiful study done with graduate students, I think, in one of the labs, who study the topic and are still susceptible to the phenomena. With respect to the experience of government, the idea that the more they interact, the better their attitudes it's interesting. I mean, one would suspect that that those who have bad experiences avoid government and just rest on their negative impressions. I was thinking as my colleagues were speaking about how few I give the Passport Office experience, how few real experiences I have had individually with my national government, when it comes right down to it, and how much how potentially important those experiences are. I mentioned taxing is just kind of routine and very, very automated, but my other experiences are as a very young man with the draft board and the Passport Office, and then these occasional contacts. And of course, when we're within the agencies, we do these by the thousands every day. But for each citizen, it's their one encounter. It's maybe one encounter in 5 years, really, with an agent of the national government.
Like crossing the border.
Yes, exactly.
Do we have any more questions? such a rich topic. Okay, please up the back, and then we'll take this one down the front.
This is Tanya Aidamoto from Stanford University. Thanks a lot for this great array of talks. I really enjoyed this. I have a question for all the speakers. It's kind of a challenge. So, because you all talked about transparency, and especially transparency in open government practices. So could you all name 3 ways that transparency provides value or creates value, public value, when we use open government practices? And could you prioritize those 3 value measures in the order of your preferred priority? Thank you.
Okay. If you'd like to go first, maybe.
Should we do one
Paul,
each
can we hand to you
first?
first?
Look, we talked a little bit about party finance. From this sort of democratic perspective that I was outlining earlier, I think transparency about political donations is the next best thing to a much more restrictive regime. I'd like to see donations really boxed in, but if we can't have that, at least the figure that Michael gave is pretty significant, and there's no doubt that those countries where money plays a very important role in the electoral process, like Japan, Italy, US, etc. Let's say the average participation in politics by citizens is not particularly high, and their view of politicians is not particularly good. I happen to think that those things are closely related, so that would be at the top of my list, transparency about that. I mentioned the example of giving citizens information about risk. I think that is a fantastic practice. The reason I find it so good is because it is also about governments overcoming their inherent paternalism, about what the public needs to know. This is about the core essence of the state. Max Weber's view of the state, that it is about, the monopoly of violence and keeping people safe within the borders and so on. Well, we are at a time where people can make their own decisions about their safety, and government can play a very important role in making those decisions informed. And the fact that a government has the guts to do that and expose itself to the complaint that, I live in postcode such and such, why is my chance, much higher of having physical harm come my way than people over in that postcode? What are you doing about it, government? I mean, that's the risk they're running by running this type of scheme. The fact that they're not, I think, is much to their credit. Thirdly, speaking as a parent, I suppose, I quite like high-quality transparency around schools and school choice. I know this has been quite controversial here. They've launched a government website called My School with very crude indicators, so you have a lot of debate that if you can only put those indicators, make those available to the public, you're not actually helping. This is sort of bad transparency because it's too limited or rigged, if you like. But I like the idea, and if we can create a better information environment, I think that's one of the education, one of the most important public services that are delivered, I think. So transparency around that would be high on my list. So my number 3, if you like.
May I? Thank you for your question. I'll try and be brief. Number 1, I would suggest that if we talk about meaningful transparency, not box-ticking exercises, then meaningful transparency helps protect against democratic capture and regulatory capture and agency capture by seeing exactly who's involved in what decision-making process, on what level, when, and to what effects. Number 2, I would suggest that meaningful transparency helps with participation, civic and political participation. One of the great stories untold yet in New Zealand is that political participation, civic participation, is astronomically big. There's all sorts of things happening all over the place, and there's not enough transparency around to show everybody these great ideas and these great stories. So simply from a learning point of view, transparency is a wonderful thing. And finally, it will just enhance the democratic process itself, because participation ultimately is what democracy is about, in my view. It's not just about elections, it's about our ability to interact, our ability to engage. We can only do that with meaningful information. We can only do that with meaningful transparency.
Okay.
Transparency is less my area than either of yours. And so it's intriguing for me to think about. I probably from what I said, it won't be much surprise for me to say, for me, where I'd like to see more transparency is with respect to process rather than outcomes. So it's an awful lot of what we see as transparency and reporting is outcomes. And the position I'm putting forth says that's great, that's this front part of the brain, but it's neglecting where trust ultimately comes from. So I would like to see more transparency about process. As I say that, I'm reminded when I worked for the US government, sometimes I think, why don't I distrust the government? And the answer is I used to work in it, and I worked with an awful lot of people who were well-intentioned and who worked very, very hard to try and take care of their charges. And I guess I think often, now that I'm outside, it would be so nice to see more of that process, to see more of that the way decisions are made, and the way that there's a careful weighing of consequences and that sort of thing. So that's about all I have to say about the topic there.
Thank you. Okay, we had another question down the front here.
Thank you. Rodney Scott from New Zealand. This is a question for Professor Lind. In your example, you talked about the impact of customer service on the sense of inclusion and exclusion. In New Zealand, we've been having a focus on making it easier and more convenient to engage with government on transactional services. And without wishing to steal Colin's thunder from his speech tomorrow, we didn't shift from doing our passport service to be more like the Apple Store. We did it to be more like the Apple Online Store. So it's now like ordering an iPad online. I was just wondering if you could comment then on the inclusion or exclusion effects of changing potentially inconvenient face-to-face services that have that personal touch and changing them towards being very convenient digital services but where you don't have that personal interaction?
I think it's interesting. It's a topic that's engaged my curiosity a lot since I've started looking at this phenomenon of government engagement, because I'm well aware of the move towards e-government. I think the key would be to be able to step in with personalized treatment where it's necessary. So I tell the story of the Apple Store, but recently my iPhone decided it wasn't going to work anymore, and I had extensive interaction with their technical support people, some of which was technological, some of which was say or key in your serial number sort of thing. But where I really needed help, there was help to be had. There were people who stepped in who seemed quite interested in my problem. So I think most of us understand the efficiency and prefer the efficiency of online interaction. We just need a help button. We need a person there. I notice more and more in commercial enterprises. So Tim Cook's no dunce. He knows. He knows how to keep people satisfied and how to keep people coming back to Apple products. But I think part of it is the realization that sometimes you have to spend the money to provide the people, well-informed, well-intentioned, well-trained people, to step in with a human interaction when people actually need it.
Just to add on to that, just a brief note. We know from there's mountains of research on face-to-face frontline public service delivery and the factors that influence that and so on. And there the concept of bureaucratic competence is very important. Is the citizen bureaucratically competent? Is the citizen up to the encounter with the frontline bureaucrat? Can they play the system, if you like? Can they play the individual that represents the system? I think the digital equivalent of that is, I guess, this idea of digital competence. And I haven't heard much about it recently, but a couple of years ago, the buzzword was always, well, we're creating inadvertently a digital divide. People are able to navigate these systems and people who aren't, and I'm not sure where that has gone, and maybe even Joe Blogg now is digitally competent, but I wouldn't take it for granted. So there's always a risk of doing right by, whatever proportion, maybe 80%, 85%, but what about the other 15%? that you know, the aging, the less educated and so on, for whom these systems are really daunting.
Okay, do we have one more question at the front there? No? Okay. Any other questions that we'd like to ask? Okay, we'll make this one the final one then.
Yeah, hello, Andrew Tideswell from New Zealand. This idea of trust, it's got so many definitions. There's competence, it's whether somebody's beliefs and decisions align with my own preferences, about whether I think they're telling the truth and so forth. And then the idea of trust, obviously you get crippled if you don't have some trust. I wouldn't get on the plane tomorrow. On the other hand, whether you're a Democrat or a despot leader, you all want the people to trust you. I'm interested in knowing on how high a pedestal does the panel put trust?
So the question is
On how high a pedestal does the panel put trust?
How high?
Is it,
How
is
high
it,
pedestal?
how much, to what
Pedestal,
degree
yeah.
is it worth pursuing over other things?
Sure.
Yeah.
May I, after you, Paul.
No, go ahead.
Well, thanks for your question. In my view, it's worth pursuing, but it's worth pursuing realistically. Political trust has always been low. I'm sure it probably always will be. However, there are ways and means of creating trust through other channels. I gave you two different types of examples today, through OGP activity, through local government activity, through community governance activities, that really fosters a genuine sense of trust. But I think it's more realistic to assume that no matter what any government does, I mean, there was trust surveys done in the Second World War for Churchill's coalition government. And even in 1943, 1944, no one trusted it. And it's renowned now as the most, kind of successful and lauded government of the 20th century, or certainly one of them in the UK. At the time, nobody trusted it. So it's being realistic. And so I think it's not about whether or not trust is good or bad. It's about where trust should lie. And I think we don't need to look at just the blanket opinion polls. As I say, in Australia, let's ask the other question, not how much you trust politicians, how much you trust your politician. You'll get a different answer.
I have a slightly different take on it. I think you have to think about the nature or the varied nature of the interactions, or if you like, the transactions that different parts of government have with citizens. Many of those transactions, certainly historically, but still to this day, government is not there to please that citizen. Government is there to take things away, to constrain their behavior, and so on. So for many years, the Dutch tax office, their sort of propaganda line was, we can't make it any more fun, but we can make it easier. Right? So it is also about what standard you apply in what type of encounter situation. I don't necessarily need to trust my politicians in the sense of liking them or fully understanding the complexity of their motives. I want their behavior to be predictable, for example. I want to know that if I push Tony Abbott in this direction, he's going to do this, right? So, in other words, predictability, reliability, sense of fairness. It may not be pleasant, but at least if it's fast and relatively painless and the forms are easy, etc., and the online environment is friendly, at least I can sort of stomach it. So, in direct response to your question, depending a little bit on how you define trust, I think it's pretty easy to overrate trust, and I think that other things are often much more essential, particularly in the interaction with those parts of the state that are there to administer pain, if you like. Yeah.
So just I'll have a quick word. One is, just to be really clear, I might have misspoken because I'm a little bit jet lagged. I don't think that trust and fairness are the same thing as satisfaction at all. I think they're quite different, and empirically they're quite different in my studies. I can predict compliance with laws. I can predict acceptance of decisions from fairness. I can't always predict them from satisfaction, or not as well. So, and while I spoke about trust, fairness is my real topic. I will say that I think any government that is regarded as unfair by a majority of its citizens has serious problems. And so for me, the question of how much emphasis do you put on trust or fairness is how bad is it? Are we leaking badly, in which case it should be a very high priority. And some of the data recently suggests we're leaking pretty badly. If you know, if we're at, you know, 80% ratings that the government is fair and trustworthy, I'm much less worried about, you know, pushing that up to 85%. But when we're, what was my number? When we're at 45, heading down to 40, it becomes more of an issue.
Okay, let us join together in thanking our speakers.